Okay, so first of all, welcome to everyone in the room, and thanks for the organization for asking me to come over to Tampere again. Last time I was in Tampere was something like 5-6 years ago, which was kind of a very weird situation. I was invited by Nokia at that time to join them for a very interesting management session on the use of open source in Nokia. And it was the time where Mr. Elop was cutting his axe through everything Nokia. So I ended up the first evening in a sauna in Tampere with some top-level managers from Nokia, and it wasn't really clear, are they sweating so much or are they crying so much? I wasn't really sure about that. But we had a very good conversation about a lot of things, and this is sort of being here now today in 2016 with all the changes that has happened with the old industry, and what we've seen here, especially here in Finland with Nokia, is a drastic sign of a fundamental change that is happening everywhere. Now, you can look at it as a catastrophe. One of the biggest and most innovative companies in the world has completely changed. Big parts have been cut off, and etc. This is one way to look at it. On the other hand, I think what we are seeing, and what will be the topic of my presentation, of my talk, is we are moving away from the Jurassic Park of giant dinosaurs into a world that is far more decentralized. If you think a little bit about what Neil just told about being cyborg and etc., one of the things that I actually liked about that part is that he said that all people are orange. Now, I'm Dutch, and our royal color is orange, so I take that as all people on this planet are Dutch people now, which is, my king will be very proud of that. But what we are seeing is, by extending reach in a sensory way as a cyborg, or in a network way as we do with the internet, what we are creating is, I hope at least in the future, less the big monopolies, the Googles, the Facebooks, and etc., and more a world of connected communities everywhere, a decentralized approach to sharing knowledge, information, and code. And in the year 2016, in which we are now, this is the year 25 after the first release of the Linux kernel. So Linus Torvalds released the version 0.1.0 in August 25 years ago. And I recently had my HR people at Red Hat do the numbers, what this means. We have now at Red Hat, Red Hat is a company with around about 10,000 people worldwide. And we at Red Hat, we have now 4% of the employees at Red Hat were born after the release of the Linux kernel. So the whole generation of people under 25 live in a world that has seen the growth of open source and has seen it exploding everywhere. We now live in a world that is actually dependent on free software and open source. There is no way you can live a day in the modern life without using open source free software technologies. When you wake up in the morning and you switch on your tablet, your mobile phone, whatever, you connect to your DSL connection at home via wireless, and you look up the news or the emails or the calendar, whatever, that DSL router has Linux inside. The big television screens you have at home, they run Linux inside. The navigation systems in your car, they run on open source and free software. The banking systems that you use to pay your bills and then collect your money, it all runs on Linux in there. So we have created something, what I call an evolutionary revolution. The revolution of open has happened without anybody noticing. And now we live in a world that is completely running on free software. And what we see is the old dinosaurs of the industry are trying to adapt to this. So, at Red Hat, we used to have an enemy for the past 20 years. This enemy was called Microsoft, because Microsoft was evil. They did proprietary stuff, and they were absolutely uncool. And they did some weird stuff with patents, and we didn't like them. Now they have become our best friends. We are now officially partnering with Microsoft at Red Hat. When I heard that news for the first time, I really had to put a bucket of cold water over my head and say, am I really awake? This is not happening. But then I talked to the Microsoft people, and then I noticed they also see this happening. What they are seeing, and this is something that I think is extremely relevant, what they are seeing in extremely short form, when you take all of their strategy stuff away, what they are seeing in the simplest form is the current generation and the new generation of developers who actually develop software is working with open source methods by default. It's not something special anymore. The young generation of developers is using tools like GitHub and Stack Overflow and Reddit as a normal part of the way they work, and they won't go back to anything else. So when you look at the concept that we had 20 years ago of companies locking up good developers in a small room for 20 years and let them develop their very specific software that is top secret and all that kind of stuff, that's gone. It's over. You will not find these developers except for some very special niche markets. And the niche markets will always exist, that is fine. But in reality, what we are seeing now is that if you are a company, if you're a city, if you are whatever organization and you use IT, and everybody uses IT, even the farmers nowadays, you know, when you sit on a modern tractor, it's almost like half a data center around you. So everybody's using IT everywhere. And what we are seeing is that of that IT stack that you have, from the very bottom, from the hardware to the very top, the services and the apps and all that stuff, around about 80% of what's in there is completely irrelevant from a competitive perspective. So if you are a company and you are competing with other companies in your vertical, then in your IT stack, around about 80% is almost exactly the same as your competition is also using. They use operating systems, they use databases, they use servers, they use this, they use that. And if 80% of that stack is effectively not setting you apart in the market, but becoming a cost factor, then it starts suddenly to make a lot of sense to have conversations about that 80% with your direct competition. So instead of seeing your competition as somebody who's evil, you can find out that effectively on that 80% level, we all have the same problems and we're all inventing the same wheel over and over again, and this stops making sense. So let us talk about that and let us focus as a company, as an organization, on that 20% on top that sets us apart in the market, that gives us competitive value, that is really secret stuff, that is the stuff that we do different than the rest of the world, but that 80% underneath isn't. And this is the power of open source. This is what we at Red Hat do. We work on that 80% for everything. And this sounds maybe a little bit science fiction-like, but it even has a name. If you're in the IT world, you know how to name a solution for that 80%. It's called Openstack. Openstack is exactly doing that, trying to deliver that 80% in a completely standardized way so that you can focus on the applications on top. Now, it doesn't stop in IT. The reason it works in IT is something deeper underneath, and that's a high level of standardization and a very high level of moving everything into software. What we are seeing very clearly is that specific hardware is leaving the market everywhere. So, you know, the big companies from the past who made money with that, the Ciscos, the EMCs, and etc., they are trying to find new ways in a world where everything is software defined. Now, I know from experience that if it is software defined, it will be ultimately open source anyway. So the more software defined we have, the more open source we will find. To give you an impression about how things have changed, you know, this is, I guess this is distributed on the internet, so I'm getting into some trouble here, but that's fine. When I started at Red Hat in 2005, which is a long time ago, and people told me open source will never work. Red Hat was a small company with 700 people worldwide doing 100-something million in revenue by selling free software, which was ridiculous anyway. And I was invited by a big Swiss bank to present open source solutions to that big bank. And the CIO was sitting there, and the top shots from the technical level were there. And I gave a presentation of 6 hours. 6 hours of demonstration. This is what Linux can do. This is what Red Hat can do. This is what open source can do. And the CIO, after 6 hours, looked at me and he said, "Well, Mr. Wildeboer, that is a very interesting presentation you gave us. It really showed us a different way of doing it. But we are a Swiss bank, and we are a big Swiss bank. And a big Swiss bank does not take any risk. And I have talked to the legal department of our bank, and they have told me that open source and free software is a communist, socialist project to take the property away from European companies, and that's why we cannot use Red Hat. And I was looking at him, and my thoughts were in regions that I will not discuss in public, but I thought, like, you are so wrong. You're talking to someone from an American company, and you're telling me from an American publicly traded company that I'm a socialist and a communist. How cool is that? I got back to that same bank in 2008 for a similar presentation about what open source can do. 2008, in the middle of the financial crisis. Everybody was looking around desperate, and nobody knew really what was happening. Things were moving in all directions. Everybody was in panic. And I sat there, and there was, of course, a new CIO, because every 3 years these companies get new CIOs. It's kind of a subscription model, I guess. So there was a new CIO, and the new CIO looked at me and said, very interesting what you showed here, and we see that open source can do a lot different now. And I said, okay, you're not going to tell me that I'm a socialist anymore. And he looked at me and said, what? And I said, well, that's what your predecessor told me, that I'm a communist. And he's like, no, I'm not going to tell you that. But we still are not really sure about open source, and we still rely on Sun technology and etc. And I looked at him and I said, here's the interesting part. Think about this for a second. We're in the middle of the financial crisis. We have meltdowns everywhere. We have billions and billions of transactions going through stock exchange markets, being handled there and defining the prices and all that kind of stuff. Now here's a number to think about. 90% of the stock exchange markets on this planet run on Linux. 75% of them run on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. The financial crisis wouldn't even be possible without free software. It's our systems that make the financial crisis work. And I'm not really sure if we're proud of that, but what I can tell you is that this is over. There's no going back anymore. Nobody ever on this planet will set up a new stock exchange market based on proprietary software. It's the fundament of everything now. And this has caused a lot of changes that go far beyond just doing open source technology. And when you look at the bigger picture we have, especially here in Tampere, we've heard open source here as a core part of the stack. We've heard about how your major told us that this conference is here not for the first time and not for the second time, this is the 20th time. And these discussions have been taken everywhere. We see other countries. I remember years ago we did a project that some of you might remember, the $100 laptop project, where we designed a little laptop for children in developing countries. And this little laptop, which is still being built today, by the way, this little laptop was planned to be $100. Never really worked out because technology is not that cheap, but we got it to around about 150. Governments would buy them, governments would give them to their children, so they had to be fully paid. It was not donationware, it was not some goodwill stuff. And the countries had to find content to share on these machines. They had mesh networking and they were really cool stuff. We did that 7 years ago. And here in the developed Western countries, the people have more or less forgotten about that we did that. But let me give you a number. This morning, 2.5 million children worldwide woke up with a $100 laptop next to them that they actively use for learning at school. It's far from non-successful. It's actually quite successful. And we decided to not talk about it here in the developed countries, because then I would have the lobbyists from Microsoft and etc. jumping at me and telling me, you cannot do this. And so you have to think in regions. And open source is extremely powerful in going into all of these regions. One of the biggest success factors we have for open source operating systems like Linux and Linux distributions is that compared to proprietary vendors, we have far more translations and adaptations to local languages. Because it's very simple to find someone who speaks a local language, to go through the translation. We try to make it as simple as possible, and everybody feels good about this. And this is how we get $100 laptops into schools everywhere, because people can use them in their local language while using a global community of technology that helps them to move on. The thing we are now looking at and we now need to work on, and everyone here in the room should also think about this, is what are we going to do next? Now that we have won this fundamental war of developers, they're on our side now, everybody is now thinking open source, using open source. We have a good set of licenses that work. We have the legal problems sorted in most ways and in every possible way. There's still some lawyers and some companies that don't buy it and don't believe it. That's fine. There's always a section of non-believers, but I can tell you for sure, as a company that does $2 billion in revenue with selling free software, it actually works quite well. So now we need to take a look at the next level. And I've been traveling across Europe, Middle East, and Africa for the past 10 years talking about open source, discussing with customers and with governments and all that kind of. And what I see very clearly now is something that started 5, 6, 7 years ago with an open data term. Everybody started to talk about open data and having access to open data. And then we had the big movement of big data, and everybody was talking about cloud computing, and now we're talking about DevOps and all that kind of. What really happens is that we are making more and more data accessible so that they can be recombined in ways that nobody has thought about before. That's the next level of licensing questions. How do you license data? My theory is extremely simple. Whatever a taxpayer has paid for should be open data. So all government data, all city data, community data, whatever is collected on a local level to the national level and even to the transnational level inside the European Union, everything that the taxpayer has paid for must be made available to anyone without any restrictions, period. No cost, no nothing. And then let the people work with it. I've seen some projects of people doing extremely interesting stuff. The one is the firefighting department in a city in Austria that was working together with the local community, with the local governance of the community, to get better data on water that they need to, if there is a fire and they need to pump water, they need to have the exact information, how much water can they get where, and etc. And this information was distributed across a lot of different organizations, and they worked together on creating a single view on that. And this single view first helped the firefighting department, of course, but now they find out that with this information they can plan far better where to build new houses and where to have a watchful eye on a lack of water and where to reconstruct stuff and what is going on. So suddenly out of this recombining of stuff, things fundamentally change. And if you go back to what Neil said about a cyborg, about adding extra senses, this is what open source is doing in software. We are recombining the genetic code of software in a lot of different ways that lead to very unexpected results. And these unexpected results is typically what moves us forward, what does the next big thing that nobody thought about. If you would go back 15 years in time and think about how we are living nowadays with our mobile phones and etc., there is this famous joke of saying we invented the coolest connected technology on this planet to send our children pictures of cats and hunt Pokemons, and that's all we do with it. And there is some truth in that, but think about the infrastructure behind it, everything that we have created that allows us now to connect and reconnect data in completely new ways. We need infrastructure to run that. We know that. This is why we have cloud computing nowadays. It needs to be completely scalable because you start with a small thing and then you end with something very big if you're lucky. That's where open source comes in. We did the numbers just for the fun. Think about this one for a second. If Google would have used Microsoft Windows for their servers, just imagine that for a second. These thousands and thousands of Google servers running on Microsoft Windows. To grow to where they were 4 years ago, they would have to pay $20 billion in software licenses just for the Windows servers. So that doesn't scale, and that's why open source is so much better on that level. Now, with the scalability that we have, with the connectivity that we have, now we need to think about what we're going to do with this. And this is where stuff gets slightly risky and weird and dangerous. I know a lot of people here in the audience, me included, by the way, just a simple question. Who here is not on Facebook? Wow. Actually, there are a few who are not on Facebook. So the other way around, more than 90% here are on Facebook. Now, Everybody's now saying that data is the new oil and all that kind of weird arguments. I don't buy that. But what I do see is that we are getting to a time where people start to think more about the use of data in general and how to control your data specifically. So what is the societal aspect of working with data and to protect it? And this is an interesting war that is going on between typically European way of thinking and the US-American way of thinking. We in Europe, we have a certain sense of data is valuable and data should be controlled, and we have data protection laws that the US don't have. And the US is saying, you people in Europe are completely stupid, you have to give it all to the market, and the market will make the best thing ever for you, and there will be paradise on earth. I think we need to be a little bit more proud of our European heritage in that, because protecting data will become more important in the future. I'm not buying into the visions of the Googles and the Facebooks. And why is that? Because as I said at the very beginning, my vision, my hope is that we're moving to a decentralized world where we have little islands of productivity, creativity, and etc. interconnected using data in the best possible way, and not giant conglomerates that control everything. When we look at the sheer size of data that Facebook and Google are moving around, you know, that's really depressing to see. Just this week or last week, Facebook and Google announced that they are together going to build a new transoceanic fiber line that's only owned by Facebook and Google, so that they can have their own fibers across the continents to hook up stuff and make data accessible. I think infrastructure on this level should always be a societal task and not a company task. Building fast infrastructure is the task of us all and not of one single company. We have privatized a lot of the communication in the past, and now slowly but surely we see a tendency backwards. So just yesterday, the Dutch government announced that the railroads in the Netherlands, which have been privatized 20 years ago, is now going to be taken back into state ownership because they say the free market has failed to deliver a competitive rail net and a competitive train system. So we're going to take it back because this is infrastructure we need as a country. And when I talk to all the visionaries and all the people with very cool projects, you know, everybody's now talking about connected cars and connected devices and all that kind of stuff. And then I look at them and I say, well, you know, it's wonderful to have a connected car that has all the information and sends all the information about how the car is feeling to the manufacturer so that you can prepare the service and everything. The problem is you shouldn't drive that car in certain parts of East Germany, because in quite some parts of East Germany you don't have the mobile connectivity that you would expect from a developed country. And if your car is not connected, then suddenly it becomes super stupid. And you know, if we don't have this connectivity everywhere, then things go wrong. A number to think about. When you take Germany, Germany is a big country. Germany is a quite developed country with a lot of people. And our internet connections are notoriously bad, and so at home I have a 16 megabit internet connection, which costs me quite a lot of money, and that's the max I can get in that part of Munich. I live in Munich, which is not exactly a small city, but that's all I can get there. Some people in the heart of Munich can get gigabit connections, but not where I live. So a friend of mine asked Deutsche Telekom, the big telco provider, how expensive would it be to bring fiber to the home, to every single building in Germany from scratch. So there is nothing, you're not extending existing infrastructure, you create everything from scratch. How expensive is that? And Deutsche Telekom did the numbers and they came up with the number and said it's going to cost round about 16 to 18 billion euro to have every single building, no matter if it's occupied or not, equipped with at least 1 gigabit per second fiber-based connection. 16 to 19 billion euro. That's a third of what Germany has invested to save one single bank in 2008. Yeah? Just, you have to see the numbers in comparison. If we as a society, and every time I talk about governments, I mean we, the citizens, the people, the owners of society in that sense. If we leave infrastructure just purely to the free market, we will not win. Somebody else will win, a big company will win. If you look at what Neil told about his cyber connectivity and then all that kind of really cool, interesting projects, right now it works quite well because internet connectivity is extremely cheap and you effectively have that. But that's changing. We are already seeing this in quite some countries, that nowadays the telcos are capping data limits. They're saying, you're not getting more than 10 gigabyte per month on your DSL connection, and then you have to pay for that. Now, if we want to move into a world of big data and connected systems where everything is connected to everything, and then every 10th of the month our telco says, sorry, you're out of business because you just reached your limit again, and you have to pay extra to participate in the modern life. This is not going to work. And that's why I think that infrastructure is more the task of society and less the task of companies. We have to have this platform everywhere. We have to have all of this stuff based on open technologies, based on open standards, and using open source wherever possible, so that we can enhance the creativity of the people to create new stuff. And we need the freedom to do that. Laws and lawmakers are right now also trying to dive into that and make sure that a lot of things are not as free as they were. I know this from personal experience. I've been fighting for years against software patents in Brussels and the evil influence that this intellectual property way of thinking has on it. My opponents have then told me I'm an anarchist and I'm again a socialist and a communist for not respecting property rights. And I'm like, no. The deal with society is not working anymore. When you look at patents, the original deal of a patent was in exchange for full disclosure of your invention, you get a limited monopoly on exploiting it commercially, 20 years. Now 20 years in the computer world is 5 generations of hardware and software. So having patent protection on software doesn't make any sense for a software developer. I cannot learn anything, and the stuff that I can see in the patents I cannot use for 20 years. So we can celebrate now, since December last year, the fundamental patents on the MP3 music format have finally expired. So this is the first time that I can actually listen to MP3 music on full open source software without infringing on patent agreements and patent licensing. This is kind of ridiculous. So while we all talk about freedom on a lot of levels and why we think that we live in a system that gives us the maximum freedom, in reality there are still a lot of fights that we need to win to get to that visionary world that I dream of, where everything is connected, interconnected, and just working. I'm not sure if all of these parts will work together, but what I do know for sure is that the current generation of developers that has grown up with open source and free software, that has deeply embedded this way of thinking, of sharing and not hoarding, of sharing as values and then making sure that by sharing things grow bigger instead of hoarding stuff and become lone heroes that defend so that nobody else knows what I know so that I can make more money. I do think we are moving in the right trajectory there. Now we need to make sure that it stays that way. We need to make sure that we understand why this is relevant. And I want everybody in this room to start programming themselves, of course. This is the same thing that I've been saying for the past 20 years. Become a developer. We have all the tools available for you for free. You can just start working on stuff, and you can see, as Neil did with his implants, how far you can go if you want to. I'm not saying we all should get antennas right now. It might be nice for a future, but what we definitely should do is become aware of what is happening to my stuff. Why is that happening, and how can I make that better? This is one of the things we at Red Hat have been doing for a long time, where we have experiences and knowledge, and I see a lot of companies now coming to me and say, Mr. Wildeboer, we want to learn about this. I want to change my vertical to do this stuff. And I've been talking to giant companies like telcos and banks and etc., and explaining to them this 80-20% model. And there was not a single CIO that has said, no, that's not correct. All of them fundamentally agree on that. So we have a big opportunity to work on these fundamental layers of interconnectivity on all possible things, not only just banks and telcos. Also for our own life, we can take our information back to us. we can become responsible for our data and use it in more productive ways. I'm talking with pharma companies right now. How can we get the data that you people are producing every day with shopping and using Facebook and etc. How can we use this into more protective and predictive healthcare systems where you get open data access that shows you how to change your diet and how to interpret the values that you get from your blood test and all that kind of stuff in a completely open way, in a way that you own the data, and we turn the whole system upside down. And I go to someone I trust, be it a company or whatever, and he gets limited access to my data in exchange for giving me good value back, for giving me good feedback, for giving me knowledge. Now, the companies in the past would try to get all this data for themselves and never give it away, and they would try to use some sneaky ways to get it. But they understand that we are now, with the internet, with the decentralization, are moving towards a time where you become responsible for your own data and your own solutions. So they want to ask you in future. They want you to cooperate with them out of trust. Now, how do you build trust on that level? By being fully transparent. So transparency, openness, and all that is moving us in the right direction, but it's not coming for free, and we need to fight for this. And as you've noticed, the only thing I said about Red Hat products is that the company exists and that I have this hat on my head, because I don't think the products we have are really that special. They become very special the moment you understand the principles and the ideas behind it. And that's the thought I want you to carry on thinking about and discussing. And if you want to, challenge me and then hit me in the face for whatever, of talking stupid stuff, that's fine. I'm outside, I'm wearing the hat, so you will find me. Thanks for listening so far, and enjoy the rest of the conference.